My name is Aníbal Pérez Liñán, and I am a professor of political science and global affairs at the University of Notre Dame. Welcome to this book launch for Boats, Drugs, and Violence, The Political Logic of Criminal Wars in Mexico by Guillermo Trejo and Sandra Ley Gutierrez. The publication of Boats, Drugs, and Violence has generated a lot of interest, and this is one of the most expected books of this season. The book deals with some of the most relevant issues in Mexico and Latin America today, I would say. The politics of criminal violence, drug cartel wars, the state's confrontations with those cartels, and the rise of criminal governance in our communities. I must say that this book represents a research agenda on the drivers of criminal violence and its implications for human rights that has been developed at the Kellogg Institute and at CIDE in Mexico over several years. I think that we are talking about more than a decade of research by now. This is an agenda of broad policy implications central to the Kellogg Institute's concerns with the quality of democracy and human development. I want to remind everyone that this is the first part of a bilingual presentation of this book. The second presentation will be in Spanish. It's organized by CIDE and will take place on September 23rd. And we will share more information about this second presentation later towards the end of this session. So without more delay, I would like to introduce our presenters today. Of course, we have the great honor of having with us the two authors of the book, Guillermo Trejo and Sandra Ley Gutierrez, and two fantastic discussants. Guillermo Trejo is Associate Professor of Political Science, a Kellogg Faculty Fellow, and I must say, Director and Principal Investigator of the Notre Dame Violence and Transitional Justice Lab at the Kellogg Institute. Sandra Ley Gutierrez is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económicas, CIDE in Mexico, and she's the coordinator of CIDE's research program on violence. Sandra is an old friend of the Kellogg Institute. She was a Kellogg visiting fellow in 2014 and 15. So they will make a brief presentation on the book, and after them, we will have two fantastic discussants. Ana Arjona, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at Northwestern University, and also a former Kellogg visiting fellow in 2016. She's the author of a wonderful book, Rebelocracy, Social Order in the Colombian Civil War. And then we will also have comments by Gustavo Flores Macias, who is Associate Professor of Political Science and Associate Vice Provost for International Affairs at Cornell University. Gustavo is the author of After Neoliberalism, The Left and Economic Reforms in Latin America, and the editor of a recent book on the political economy of taxation in Latin America. The plan for today is that each of the presenters and the two discussants will have 10 minutes each. First, Guillermo and Sandra will introduce the book, and then Ana and Gustavo will make some comments. And we would like to be efficient because we don't have a lot of time, so please, as you have some questions about the presentations, please send us your questions in the question and answer chat. So we will, then I will relate your questions to the presenters. I want to thank you all for being here today. And I want to thank you, our fantastic presenters and discussants for this session. Thank you. Guillermo.
So thank you, Aníbal, for such a kind presentation. It's really an honor to have you chairing this panel, and to have Gustavo and Ana discussing. It's two fantastic scholars. And thank you to the Kellogg Institute, Notre Dame, and to CIDE in Mexico City for enabling this bilingual book launch today and next week. Let me start by sharing my screen. It'll be a quick presentation. So let me start by sharing the cover page of the book, and thank you everyone who's joining this webinar from South Bend and different parts of the US and Mexico City and different parts of Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, Western Europe and other parts of the world. This is really a privilege to have you all in this conversation. And let me start just by saying something about the book cover. This is a book published by Cambridge University Press. And what you see is a car bomb that exploded a few weeks after a local election cycle in the city of Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. This is a time when 2010, 2011, when many of us, Sandra, myself, many other scholars, victims, practitioners, were really wondering about levels of violence in Mexico, and most specifically, we were wondering that 10 years after transitioning from authoritarian rule to democracy, by 2010, Mexico experienced levels of violence significantly greater than what we typically see in civil wars. This was a pretty shocking reality to everyone after 10 years into democracy. And we began seeing, many of us, that criminal violence seemed to be intimately connected with politics and with the dynamics of Mexico's transition to electoral democracy. So part of the problem for us is that major theories of criminal violence in criminology, sociology, and economics had very little to say about politics. Because in many of these disciplines, scholars saw drug cartels or organized criminal groups as private illegal enterprises. They also saw the drug trafficking industry and different organized criminal industries as a political phenomenon. And that was not particularly helpful. So while we build on criminology, so the sociology of crime and the economics of crime, we're part of a new generation of scholars that for the past 10 to 15 years in different parts of the world, having trying to develop a political theory of organized crime and criminal violence. So in the book, you'll find a chapter, a theoretical chapter that seeks to develop our own view on the politics of criminal violence, in which we engage with several scholars in the criminal violence literature, but also in the Civil War literature. What became clear to us, as it's become clear to almost anyone who's developed a book in the past 10 to 15 years on these subjects, is that we need to go back to basics and redefine basic terminology. And part of the reason is because there's some assumptions that have been held in the criminology literature for a long time. One of them being that the sphere of crime and the sphere of the state are separate spheres. The other one is that the engagement between the state and criminals can be portrayed as a zero-sum relationship in which the greater the state presence, the lower the activity of organized crime, and the higher the activity of organized crime, the lower the relationship of the state. We were dissatisfied with these two ideas, these two assumptions of state and crime as belonging to separate spheres or this zero-sum relationship. And together with many other scholars, we began looking into the relationship of state and crime as two spheres that are not separate, but that intersect. And that when they intersect, they give rise to this gray zone of criminality, which for us is really an ecosystem where you have many different forms of engagement between state actors and criminal actors. And for us, ontologically, organized crime really brings together, organized crime is a network of structures of state and criminal actors coming together. What's interesting about this Venn diagram is that you can see that the state is not homogeneous and crime is not homogeneous. There's state agents that are law enforcement agents and those who collude with organized crime. And there's ordinary crime and then there's organized crime. So up to this point, we are in dialogue with the literature, but I think here is where we start trying to make specific contributions by really trying to understand which are those state institutions and those state agents that engage in the gray zone of criminality most proactively. It's not necessarily members of the Ministry of Education or the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Housing, but specifically those in the security sector and the judicial sector. And the next slide really brings in those actors, members of the military, members of the police, members of the Secret Service. And what you see in this figure is that, again, it's not all members of the military and not all members of the police who are engaged. Some engage, others don't engage. And it's really this network of relationships between these members of the security sector and organized criminal groups that create these networks, these criminal structures that emerge in this gray zone of criminality. We add to the discussion by bringing political regimes in, because while these type of relationships exist and develop in democracy, they more generally develop in autocracies. And here's where we bring political regimes to the discussion. We find these type of relationships emerging in all kinds of autocracies in Latin America: military dictatorships, one-party authoritarian regimes, personalistic dictatorships. And members of the security sector are not only functional to autocrats because they repress political dissidents. They have access to lots of information to do their job. They have a comparative advantage in violence, and they also have guaranteed impunity. But that does not guarantee that they could not use these powers to actually subvert autocracy and to conduct a coup and go against autocrats. And what we suggest here is that a pattern that we find from Cuba to Cuba under Batista, or Bolivia in the 1970s, to Panama, to Chile, to Mexico, to Guatemala, to El Salvador, under different types of autocracy, is that autocrats often provide selective incentives to organized criminal groups, members of organized criminal groups, to maintain their loyalties. So in autocracies, we see the development of this type of different forms of engagement between members of the security sector and organized criminal groups. We don't have it here in the graph, but the justice system, members of the justice system also play a key role in this type of engagements to the extent that they provide impunity. Now, the key question for us is what happens when countries transition from authoritarian rule to democracy and keep these type of structures and relationships intact. So we know that several countries transition from authoritarian rule to democracy and dismantle these structures by adopting transitional justice mechanisms. This is research I've done with Juan Albarracin, Lucia Tiscornia, also from former members of the Notre Dame community, that shows that. So countries that transition from authoritarian rule to democracy and adopt transitional justice processes tend to dismantle this type of structures and minimize the gray zone of criminality. Also, like many of you in the audience who've worked on security sector reforms, to the extent that there's a democratization of the military forces, the police, or the Secret Service, these type of relationships get dismantled when there's reforms of the judiciary. But countries like Mexico that fail to adopt transitional justice processes, fail to reform the security sector, fail to reform the judiciary, countries like Mexico or Brazil or Honduras or partially Guatemala or El Salvador, these are countries that are more likely to set the stage for the intimate connection between electoral politics and criminal violence. And this is a scope condition of the book. We study Mexico because it's a country that failed to reform, to adopt transitional justice processes, to reform the security sector, and therefore was more likely to experience the intimate connection between electoral politics and criminal violence. So this is what we propose in the book. One of the most important propositions we make in the book is that when countries transition to electoral democracy, thin transitions to illiberal democracies. So in countries like Mexico, there's electoral competitions, elections are increasingly free and fair, but it is a country that did not develop a democratic rule of law. As a result, many of the mechanisms that we associate with electoral democracy, electoral competition, partisan alternation, the decentralization of political power, tragically and sadly become triggers of criminal violence. Because by redefining state power, they not only redefine power relationships in the country, but they affect and upset the criminal underworld, the gray zone of criminality. And this is what you have here, one of the propositions we make, partisan alternation may compromise the protection levels provided by security forces to organized criminal groups, and that becomes a trigger of violence. So let me just, what we'll do what we do in the rest of the book, and this is the last part of what I will present, is that we walk through this, following this logic. We try to understand how electoral competition and party alternation at the subnational level in Mexico triggered the outbreak of inter-cartel wars, how in democracy, the decentralization of political power, the partisan fragmentation along Mexico's federal system also became triggers of violence, and Sandra will talk about that. So let me just go into trying to answer one simple question: why did cartels go to war in Mexico? And let me get you back in the 1980s, when Mexico's drug industry was controlled mostly by 4 cartels. Up to this point, members of the military had played a key role in providing protection for the rise of these cartels. But in 1985, Mexico experienced a decentralization of coercive power, and the coercive branch of the state became decentralized to the subnational level. State-level police forces became not only the repressive branch of the state to repress political dissidents, but also became the ones who provided many of the networks of protection that allowed these 4 cartels to come into power and to become key actors in international in the international drug industry. What we know is that many of these cartels went to war in the 90s. Approximately 250 battle deaths in these conflicts in the 90s, but by 2006, more than 1,500. And what we know, sadly, is that this is intimately connected with dynamics of transition to democracy. What I have here in this map, the upper west part, is that what we signal here is the state that experienced the first major transition, party alternation. That's the state of Baja California. Well, right after the PRI lost power in 1989, 1990, and an opposition governor came in, we saw the outbreak of the first criminal war between the Sinaloa cartel and the Tijuana cartel. If you fast forward a few years, Chihuahua becomes democratic or experiences alternation. We see a second major outbreak of criminal violence. And we can continue with this story. The state of Jalisco experienced another party alternation, and we see another outbreak of criminal violence. In Mexico's Wild West, the Sinaloa cartel fighting against the Juarez cartel and the Tijuana cartel. A little later on, we see an alternation in Nuevo León in the late 1990s, followed by a major outbreak of criminal wars. And then other alternations in Michoacán and Guerrero. So why do we see that? Well, subnational party alternation in Mexico led to the breakdown of protection, created lots of uncertainty and vulnerability for the cartels, who reacted by creating their own private militias, not only to protect their fiefdom, but also to try to conquer rival territories. And that's how we saw the outbreak of inter-cartel wars throughout Mexico's territory. We provide lots of statistical evidence in the book. Here, I would just like to call your attention to this first finding that on average, a state experiencing alternation experienced an increase of 75 percentage points of violence compared to one that did not experience alternation. So what did this alternation really imply in terms of the drug industry? Well, this is an image that portrays all cartels. This is what cartels looked like in the 1980s. Many of them, if you think about the Juarez cartel or the Tijuana cartel, they were centralized family businesses. But after these cartels partially lost protection, government protection, and had to renegotiate that protection with their own private militias, cartels became this type of structures. So what's interesting here is that not only do you have the drug lords and their families, but what you have is the creation of private militias, a very complex structures in which you have lieutenants, plaza chiefs, and street gangs who are all members of private militias. And this is something that has been ignored for a long time in Mexico, but that we cannot longer ignore the importance of cartels, but also of private militias. And this is my last slide. Violence increased during these years to unprecedented levels. This is prior to the launching of the war on drugs. This is what Felipe Calderón actually saw in 2006, this type of map of violence. But sadly, President Calderón and his administration ignored pretty much the story we've told up to this point. I stop here and pass it on to Sandra.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the possibility of presenting this with the Kellogg community. We feel very honored to do so. And continuing on from Guillermo's presentation, exactly what we aim to do here is to understand what happens precisely after that period with Felipe Calderón's declaration of war against drug cartels. So in the third part of the book, what we explore is that the war on drugs, in which President Calderón declared the war on drugs after one of the most competitive presidential elections, and in the context of acute political polarization. That is something that we really have to keep in mind, and that it's a crucial part of our argument, as we will discuss next. So in this context of the war on drugs, what the government did was launch 16 military campaigns and across the country in some of the most conflicted regions, and violence is skyrocketed. Gustavo Flores Macias, who is kindly discussing our book today, has done brilliant work that dissects the causal mechanisms between militarization and violence. And so this increase in violence is what's puzzling. In just 6 years, between 2007 and 2012, violence in Mexico increased by a factor of 5. The federal intervention had a dramatic effect, and there was a particular intensification of violence in 3 new focal points, as you can see in the map on the right-hand side of your screen, in the Gulf, the center, and center north. So this begs the question, as in the beginning of the slide that I was sharing with you, is why did the state's war against cartels intensify violence? What our contribution in this book and what we're trying to push forward is to move beyond the militarization aspect and explore the politicization of the intervention. As I noted, and as Guillermo was saying before, this is a context we cannot disregard. This is a context of a neoliberal democracy that fails to limit the presidential power, and occurring against the background of an acute political polarization and military intervention that reflects political divisions. I'm going to go into why political polarization was so important here, but in this background conditions of a neoliberal democracy and polarization, what happens is that it matters who are copartisans and who are on the other side of the political spectrum. So in vertical integrated political regions, national and subnational copartisan authorities cooperate, they share information, local governments become then empowered to confront cartels and effectively contain violence. However, when there's partisan fragmentation, then this leads to intergovernmental conflict. The president does not cooperate with subnational authorities and leaves them unprotected and vulnerable to violence. Ultimately, what happens is that cartels take advantage of political polarization to try to conquer new markets and territories. And so why this emphasis on on polarization? Well, because we cannot forget that the military intervention in Mexico took place amid a profound political polarization. Despite differences between PAN and PRD during the 1990s, there was a shared desire for free and fair elections, which created a space for cooperation. However, in the post-authoritarian period, economic and sociocultural dimensions became the battleground for confrontation between the left and the right. As such, then what happened is that partisan conflict and political polarization reached a peak when López Obrador became subject of impeachment just 1 year before the presidential election. The 2006 campaign took place in a political environment that was highly polarized between the left and the right. It was in this polarized context that Calderon's military intervention took place. And so, following our argument, what we find is precisely that in municipalities in pan-dominated states, so the first two lines that you see in your screen, those are pan-dominated states. The first two, the second reference that you see in this line refers to the party of the governor. In those states, in the pan-led states, violence was actually decreasing. In contrast, if you go in at the end of this graph, what you see is that most violent municipalities were opposition municipalities in leftist states, and that's where the most violence was occurring. So despite having despite having similar conditions, maybe even in regions that were fairly similar, and I'm going to show you next an example of this. The party ID of the government was crucial here in determining how violence played out. Specifically, for example, something that we do throughout the book is conducting a series of natural experiments, and we compare the evolution of inter-cartel violence across a number of municipalities located, for example, in the state of the west, along the state borders of western states of Michoacán and Jalisco. Despite multiple similarities across neighboring municipalities, an important difference between Michoacán and Jalisco was that Michoacán was being governed by the PRD, while Jalisco was being governed by the PAN. So what happened is that President Calderon worked closely with his PAN co-partisans in Jalisco, while in Michoacán the federal intervention was unilateral. There was no dialogue between the military and the state security forces, and there was a twofold difference at the end in the number of drug-related murders among these two sets of neighboring municipalities. Again, these are municipalities that share a lot of similarities in terms of cartels activities, in terms of social demographics. And what we're saying is that the very key difference was the party ID of the governor, and that was crucial for how violence played out, leading to this fragmentation of power, leaving local authorities vulnerable to crime and to organized crime activity. One of the pieces precisely of information that tells us a lot about the vulnerability of mayors and other subnational authorities is precisely attacks that were occurring against mayor and local party candidates. And that's a question that we attend in the fourth part of the book. Why is it that organized crime would do such attacks despite the fact that they call so much attention? We observed that between 1995 and 2006, there were only a few attacks. And after 2006, there was a high-profile wave of attacks of criminal violence that was occurring. And something that is very interesting to look at is that this was mainly concentrated among municipal level officials and party candidates. 80%, more than 80% of these attacks were occurring at the municipal level of authorities. And this was more so was occurring during local election cycles. What you see in your screen in the dotted line referred to local election cycles. It was during local election cycles that we see a spike in organized crime attacks against party candidates and local authorities. It is also important to note, however, that organized crime does not target one municipality at a time, but entire regions. So you see that there is a region for Michoacán and Guerrero, for in the southwest part of Mexico, or in the northeastern part of the country, where organized crime had the interest of building larger territories under control. So why is it that cartels would do so? We argue that when drug cartels are engaged in intense turf wars, drug lords will have incentives to launch attacks against local government officials and political actors as a way to gain protection, to capture rents, to control local government structures. But at the same time, drug lords order attacks when it is possible to do so, such as when authorities are vulnerable and unprotected, as it occurs in regions where power was vertically fragmented. And cartels also seek to take advantage of opportunities to colonize local governments, such as local election cycles, moments that have become crucial, right, to start to transform local governance. But ultimately, what criminal groups want is also to build territorial control, and so they will attack neighboring municipalities, which ultimately will allow them to establish criminal governance. Criminal governance regimes, which there is a growing work that has been done from political science, understanding the different controls that organized crime exerts at the local level in terms of the politics, the economics, the economy, and the social life of neighborhoods and districts in urban areas. They attempt to capture rents, to monitor and manipulate civilian organizations. And so what do we find? We confirm effectively that partisan intergovernmental conflict between a conservative president and leftist governors affected mayors and local party candidates. So you can see in your screen that in the lower part of this graph, what you are observing is that mayors and local party candidates in PRD-led states became likely candidates of attacks because they were relatively cheaper mechanisms to exert control than bribes. Going again into this logic of natural experiments, when we look again at two very similar group of municipalities in Michoacán and Guerrero in Tierra Caliente, very similar socio-demographic conditions, geographic conditions, cartel activity, the key difference in 2011 between this two set of neighboring municipalities is that Michoacán had elections while Guerrero did not, and this subnational election cycle was crucial for organized crime in Michoacán to start controlling local politics as they began to seize the electoral processes, colonize municipal governments, and control local economies. It was one of the most violent electoral cycles in Michoacán, with over 40 candidates that were assassinated by organized crime. But ultimately, what we strive also in this book is to contribute to the building of political science of organized crime that can inform democratic security policy. And there are three key messages that we believe this book leaves for a broader audience in terms of how instead of focusing in eliminating criminal bosses, democratic elites should be focusing on identifying or removing authoritarian specialists in violence, who are at the center of protection networks. Second, that a key element in the reform of security and the judicial institutions is a depoliticization of law enforcement, making it possible for civilian oversight. And third, that the failure to reform authoritarian sources of power can have devastating effects for the evolution of democracy, because ultimately organized crime in Mexico has become deeply intertwined with key elements of democracy, such as party alternation, competition, and decentralization.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Guillermo, for the excellent presentation. This is a fantastic project. We will now move to the discussants. First Ana and then Gustavo. I don't want to interrupt. It's a bit strange to let you know about time in this context. So I don't want to interrupt you. So if you keep track of the chat function, I will let you know about your time when you're reaching your time in the chat. Ana, please go ahead.
Thank you, Aníbal. Thank you, Guillermo and Sandra, for inviting me to discuss your book. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. So it is really with great pleasure that I read the book. I read it before and I read the last version. It's really an amazing contribution. and I'll say a few things about what I think the strengths of the book are, and sort of what readers can expect to learn from it. And then I'll turn to some questions for discussion, just to push you to tell us more and to help us think about some of the implications that we can derive from the book. So let me start with the strengths of the book. So the book makes many contributions to our theoretical understanding of large-scale criminal violence and various dynamics associated with it. So I think one of the strengths of the book is that it sort of disaggregates different types of violence. It disaggregates time and space and sort of the diffusion of violence. And it really forces us to think about violence in a detailed way, right? It's sort of unpacking different dynamics that are linked to violence. You look at why these groups are going to be targeting and killing local officials. You look at criminal governance. So it's also looking at some of these additional dynamics that come with violence itself. A key contribution, and I think this was very clear in your presentations, is the focus on politics, especially regimes and elections. And this has been really absent from most of the analysis so far. So I think this is one of the main contributions, something that political scientists should have done before. And it's sort of adding to the understanding of organized crime, how the fact that we have a system to allocate power, how that is going to impact the strategies of criminal organizations, and how in turn criminal organizations may affect the dynamics of the distribution of power, which is electoral politics, right? And so I think in the book, you rightly point out that political scientists have sort of been looking at these dynamics from sort of from the distance only recently, and I think to a great extent because of Mexico, we have like a critical mass of scholars looking at these dynamics. Of course, we have amazing political scientists who did this before, like Desmond Arias, but it's now that we're really paying attention, and I think your book is sort of opening the door for political scientists to really think carefully about the role of politics in organized crime. So I think this is a very important contribution. Another key aspect of the book, and readers will find this very quickly, is that the book really focuses on different moments or stages of these criminal wars, right? So it's the outbreak of the war, the intensification or escalation, and the expansion of these wars. And the authors theorize the conditions under which this happens and how it happens. And then they give us specific empirical chapters that show different types of evidence to test hypotheses on the conditions under which these different dynamics are happening again at the different stages. And so you finish the book and you really have a nuanced sense of these different stages in the war. I think the contributions are mostly, of course, to the study of violence and organized crime, but also to corruption, to democratization, to state building, because a lot of states in the global South are actually continuing to be formed and strengthened in the context of these different types of competitions with organized criminal groups, and these dynamics have to shape this process, right? So I think that is an important contribution, and of course, institutional development as well. How are different state and non-state institutions developing in the context of these criminal wars? I want to highlight the conceptual clarity of the book. I think the authors really made a very big effort to introduce concepts in a very clear way, to clearly specify what are the assumptions, what are the hypotheses, the mechanisms, and we readers should always demand this and value it when we see it, because it really makes it easier for us to understand the logic of the argument. And the last part regarding the theory that I think is very commentable is how interdisciplinary the book is, right? So you really took seriously the sociology of organized crime. You took seriously what economists have said about organized crime. You took seriously what political scientists have said. And unfortunately, this is not often the case, right? So we see a lot on organized crime from economists who don't read a page of what sociologists have said, or political scientists. I think you are sort of taking this seriously and really trying to engage with different disciplines and build from them. And in relation to this as well, I think there is a big gap, you discuss it in the book, in how we in political science and in other disciplines are sort of learning what is it that we have learned from civil wars that we can apply to understanding criminal wars and organized crime, right? And there are a few fantastic papers out there that you cite that help us to think about this, but you really do a very good work in the book of trying to read very carefully the literature on civil wars and try to understand what is it that we can learn from that and how sort of to cross that bridge, right? And use those insights in a careful way to better understand organized crime. And finally, the empirics are fascinating. I think you rely in a very good way on quantitative evidence and then identify the holes and what the quantitative evidence cannot really help us understand. And then you rely on qualitative evidence and historical analysis of these neighboring municipalities to give us more nuance and to try to test more your hypotheses and mechanisms. So it's a good example of how to do mixed methods work with different evidence and with different methods. And finally, I think the book is a very detailed and deep description of the horrible years, decades now, that Mexico has endured. So I think for people who just want to learn more about Mexico, it is also a fantastic book. Okay, so a lot of minutes on praise. I shouldn't have done that. Now I can ask you some questions. So I have many, but I'll just focus on a few. So when we think on the onset of criminal wars, I'm really interested in thinking about what your theory can teach us about other cases in the world. So some of my questions are going to push you on a few things. So the first question is, to what extent does the fact that we have a country with just a huge size in the legal economy matters, right? So would you expect the same if Mexico were not south the border to the largest consumer of cocaine and between the producers of cocaine, the Andes, and that consumer, right? So to what extent does the size of these profits matters? The second question is, how important is it to have the act of prosecution of the state for all these dynamics to be triggered, right? So had Calderon not declared the war against the cartels, I mean, Sandra, in your presentation, it was clear that you're taking that as an important point, but your main hypothesis is about the lack of a transitional justice policy, right? So in the absence of a transitional justice policy of security sector reform, but in the absence of these wars declared by the state, would you expect these groups to respond in the same way? Or would they just maybe find new the ways to grow and to keep doing what they do if they are not feeling this competition or this prosecution from the state? And the third point is, even if you have transitional justice, even if you really purge some of these agencies in the state, but again, you have these really large profits, why would you expect violence not to go up? So my expectation would be that the members of these organizations, even if you decapitate the groups, even if you get rid of all the bad apples in all the Secret Service and the police and everywhere, you have a lot of human capital that has been trained in these illicit economies. Why would we expect this to sort of disappear or to keep being a low-scale organized crime and not to just erupt in violence as they transform, as they adapt, and they try to survive? Now, on the use of violence subnationally, a couple of questions. So the first one is, how important is it to have a federal system for the logic of your argument to apply? As I think of other countries in Latin America, that work differently in terms of how the national, regional, or state level and municipality level authorities relate. I'm not sure if we should expect something similar or if this is really a scope condition that you have a federal system. And then thinking so throughout the book, you identify many different uses for violence. Violence is used to achieve different goals, but usually this happens under the same circumstances. So how can we know empirically? Theoretically, you have many different paths, causal paths, right? But empirically, how do we know why violence is used for one purpose or another, right? Sometimes it's used to fight the state. Sometimes it's supposed to be used to fight other rivals. Sometimes it's supposed to be to create criminal governance regimes. How do we know that? Can we know? And then finally, on criminal governance, one question I have is, if the goal is to create these criminal governance regimes, why would violence be the preferred strategy in so many cases, right? Because it's so large, the violence against public officials. Why not try to bribe them? Sandra mentioned that it's less costly, but you're also attracting the attention of a lot of authorities, and you're also undermining cooperation from civilians and from other people who you may need, because in these criminal governance regimes, you cannot just really survive based on coercion, right? You need some voluntary cooperation, and if you are relying on all this violence, you are going to undermine that a lot. So why would they really opt for violence so often? And I'll leave it at that on criminal governance. And then finally, just a couple of questions on implications, and I'll end in 30 seconds. I see Aníbal is looking at the clock. So the first one is, what are the lessons that you see as we think about policies in all these Latin American countries that are growing more and more violent because of organized crime, right? So this is a pattern. It's not just Mexico. A lot of our countries are increasingly challenged by organized criminal groups that are growing more and more violent and with more and more profits in these markets. What are some of the lessons beyond sort of doing these security sector reforms? And finally, do you see any policy implications that are different at the national, state, and municipality levels as authorities and civic society actors try to reduce the violence? Well, congratulations again, it's a fantastic book.
Thank you, Ana. Thanks for the excellent comments. Gustavo, please go ahead.
Thank you, Aníbal. I'd like to thank Guillermo and Sandra for the opportunity to comment on this book, and Aníbal, of course, for moderating, Kellogg for hosting the event. I organized my remarks into 3 parts. And first, I will provide my thoughts on the book itself, sort of some general overview of what I think about the book. Then I'll focus on what I believe are some of its key findings and implications. And in the last section, I'll raise a few questions the way Ana did, that at least the book sparked in my mind. So first, let me say a few words on the book in general. And let me also start by saying that reading this book was a real treat for me for many reasons. I think it's an impressive book in terms of depth and breadth. Not only does it walk the reader through several important questions related to the onset, continuation, and consequences of violence, but it does so from many, many different angles and techniques. The book is also extremely well written. To put it bluntly, at least in my case, it's an academic book whose prose actually sucked me in. And I think this will be true for anybody. It's an academic book you actually want to read. So let me offer a few specifics and maybe to provide some examples as to why I say this. First, both drugs and violence is important because it helps us understand one of the tragedies of Mexico's transition to democracy. What was supposed to be a celebration after this transition became only partly so, and it also opened the door to countless deaths, disappearances, and suffering. So the notion that democracy would bring all good things to Mexico was quickly and cruelly dissipated. And this book helps us make sense of this unfortunate outcome. In this sense, the book also helps us understand a broader phenomenon, which is the drastic escalation of violent crime in the context of Latin America's dual transition, both to democracy and to decidedly pro-market economies. Another important contribution of the book is that it brings politics back into the mix in an arena where sociological and economic-centered explanations have dominated to explain the rise of crime in general and violent crime in particular. But the book brings back politics by placing elections and regimes in conversation with these broad crime-related literatures. For example, connecting the uncertainty that elections and turnover generate with the economic imperatives that are central to illicit markets. In this sense, the display of knowledge of these bodies of literature is truly impressive. If anybody wants to get a good sense, not only of the state of the art, but also the general state of affairs in the study of violent crime in Latin America, this book is your place to turn. A key feature that moves the literature forward is the understanding of organized criminal organizations as being not in opposition to the state, but being fundamentally intertwined with it. And this is a point that is very often missed. Unfortunately, an us versus them, or good guys versus bad guys mentality permeates our understanding of criminal organizations and their behavior. As the authors show clearly throughout the book, criminal activity thrives in the gray zone of criminality because of complicity of society and authorities. The notion that organized criminals are these shadowy, remote individuals detached from the average person is misguided, as the author suggests. And rather, the informant, the attorney, the judge, the hitman, these are all somebody's friend or father or mother or uncle or brother, right? Rather than the mean-looking or soulless thug that operates in this underclothes location. And perhaps the image of the narco junior seems more accurate, right? The young, sort of well-groomed guy wearing trainers and sweatpants, and perhaps captured during a morning jog by the police or the military. Naturally, this realization is difficult to swallow, but it is essential, and it's one of the book's key contributions if we are to find solutions to this problem. Let me say just quickly something about the research design and the methodological approach. The book's data collection is impressive, both in terms of the coverage from quantitative data sets on violent episodes against the population in general, politicians in particular, but also in terms of the in-depth qualitative fieldwork conducted in several states. There are so many quality interviews reflected here in this book that bring quite a bit of nuance to otherwise very impressive, or to general quantitative data that is also very impressive, but that can stay at the general level. And here, I found myself wondering, well, I wonder how this was working out in Nuevo León or in Guerrero, in Chihuahua. And every time there was an interview, every time there was qualitative evidence to support this. And also impressive is that in spite of the challenges to inference that illicit activities present, the study of crime in general, the book boldly transcends correlational claims and moves into the causal territory through a wealth of methods, including synthetic controls, natural experiments. This is very, very hard to do, and the book does it so well. Now, let me say a word about some of the book's key findings, and I'll mention just 4 of them. A key finding: the authors show that cartel violence emerged before the generalized constabularization of the armed forces that began in 2006, and even before the transition to democracy in 2000. That is, cartel violence during the period in which the democratic alternation of power was taking place at the subnational level. Now, a key implication of this finding is that reality is much more complex than common narratives make it seem. It's not that one party is more corrupt than another, or that one party is more competent than another. The book points to electoral dynamics beyond parties, beyond individuals, in the context of a highly politicized environment that paints a much more complicated picture. So this should give us quite a bit of food for thought as we move into the next electoral cycle. A second key point: in my view, the book provides a major indictment of the lack of statecraft among the country's political leadership for quite some time. The book amasses a wealth of convincing evidence of this discretionary use of authority. And in this sense, the rise of violence is not due to coordination problems across elected officials from different parties, but to electoral conflict, in which partisanship selectively drives where the government seeks to assert authority and perhaps some semblance of the rule of law. I find this finding highly consequential and also devastating. A third key point: the book highlights the downstream consequences of impunity built during the authoritarian regimes in general, the pre-years in particular. So what might have seemed like benign cronyism or minor impunity at the local level for decades in Mexico, the truth is that impunity spiraled out of control to the point where not even the best intentioned governments can tame the beast. Impunity, which fuels what Trejo and Ley, I think, aptly dubbed the gray zone of criminality, unfortunately cannot be confined to certain spheres of life. If society tolerates it, it will permeate into the most fundamental task of the state and will impair the government's ability to provide basic protection for life and private property. When unchecked, impunity will eventually become a way of life. And this is what has happened in the Mexican case. This is something that this book highlights so well. A final point is that this book's findings reinforce a recommendation to move away from militarized approaches to law enforcement and focus instead on reforming the civilian police and the judiciary. The depoliticization of public safety is a key recommendation. The same way that central banks perhaps enjoy some level of autonomy from political decisions so that the apparatus is not dismantled with every election, the book calls for the adoption of similar mechanisms. And these mechanisms should not be meant to put security officials beyond the reach of democratic oversight, as perhaps some central banks are, but rather to reduce the uncertainty and interruption of progress generated with every change in office. So the establishment of longer time horizons and citizens' boards of oversight from different members of society could be potential options. And I think this is also an important contribution or an implication that stems from the book. Just to finish, I will raise a few questions that came to mind. I think just like with every good text, such as Guillermo and Sandra's exemplary book, these are some questions that just came to mind. First, at the most general level, is there hope for an equilibrium in which alternations in power do not lead to these outcomes? Is the damage done once organized crime establishes militias, or can we expect, let's call it a normalization of democratic alternation for the purposes of violent crime in Mexico? Second, fragmentation, and this is similar to a question that Anna had. Fragmentation is an important part of the story. It's unlikely, we cannot think of turning Mexico into a non-federal system. It's probably an unlikely future scenario in the near term, but there has been debate about the merits of some policy solutions that have to do with perhaps single chains of command or mando único in the structures of policing in Mexico. Do you find your findings supporting this perspective of a centralization of authority and at least the chain of command? Now, the book makes the case that electoral turnover disrupts existing networks of complicity. But is there a case to be made that it can also bring accountability and therefore progress in addressing violent crime? I'll stop there, but I cannot emphasize enough how much this book has to offer, not only from an academic perspective, but especially from a policy vantage point. It was, as I said, a true delight to read, and I learned so much from it. And in spite of the importance of the findings and even the elegance of the methods, I appreciated that the book is written for a number of audiences with no jargon, as impressive research does. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share these thoughts. Congratulations, Guillermo and Sandra, for a very impressive piece of scholarship. Thank you.
Thank you, Gustavo. Perfect timing and wonderful comments. We have about 15 minutes to close the presentation, and we have some questions from the audience. So if you allow me, Guillermo and Sandra, I would like to refer to you some of the questions from the audience, and so that you are able to discuss some of those and also address some of the comments, some of the great comments that Anna and Gustavo had made. To the extent that you want. I think one of the points that Gustavo just raised is that democracy in the book is disappointing, right? Has side effects that can be disappointing in terms of violence. And I think some of the questions that we received from the audience relate to this issue. One of the questions says, what are the consequences of organized crime or the presence of organized crime in a transitioning democracy, which I relate to your point about Mexico being an illiberal democracy in the book. And similarly related to the problem of democracy, Denisa Hashari asks, would you say that the militarization of everyday life in Mexico and the use of force to mediate conflict places Mexico in an almost permanent state of exception? And how might Mexico help us understand the function of sovereign power and democracy and the relationship with the rule of law?
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the very kind and generous comments. It is great to hear that it's been, that you've enjoyed the book, that you like it, that it can have this contributions at the empirical and theoretical level. These are great questions that I wish we could, of course, address them all, but I'm going to take some of them because these are key questions that Guillermo and I had been thinking about over and over again as we were writing the book. addressing, for example, Anna's comment on geography. I think that geography is something that comes over and over again, even when you look into Mexico in some cases, that you wonder what the geography, what it implies in terms of routes, in terms of richness of resources, right, that may be available. I think that we cannot deny that the strategic place being between the U.S. And a broad market in the South, in South America. I think that is a crucial issue, of course, on how violence has played out. But I think that even in the absence of those elements, as part of the main argument for the book is precisely that the way that institutions were built, the legacies that were left by the authoritarian regime, were crucial for how violence ended up playing out. So we could Guillermo's work in other contexts, for example, has also shown, right, how the lack of reform for the security system becomes crucial for how violence plays out, regardless of how close you are, right, to the U.S. or to the South American market. I think so. I think that's a contribution that we're making here in terms of how institutional building and that polarization between those institutions can be crucial. Whether federalism is also an essential part or a condition behind it, behind our argument, what we're trying to do in the book is show, we're trying to be very careful in what are the specific mechanisms between federalism and how it can contribute, right, to that process of politicization. However, I think we also have wonderful work from Angélica Durán Martínez, right, showing that even in non-federal systems in Colombia, we have evidence, right, on how cooperation can be likely or less likely. However, I think that the crucial thing for the crucial element for our research is understanding the mechanisms between a federal in a federal country that can lead to a level of politicization that we probably will not be able to see under other circumstances, along with polarization. The intention behind violence, and as you know, Anna, that's very hard to pinpoint and to understand what's really going on. However, I think that our point here in the book is not to necessarily being able to disentangle all those intentions. It would be very difficult to do, but the ultimate outcome, which would be criminal governance, right? And how whether it was a murder that was the result of a mayor resisting organized crime, or a result of a mayor actually being colluded with another group. Ultimately, the outcome is how those attacks open the door to a transformation, a wide transformation of local governance. And that's the key point of our research. I would say that how institutions are changing, economies are changing, populations are being controlled in what they do and what they cannot do. And so while the intention may be difficult to pinpoint, I think it touches upon criminal governance that is deeply transforming how we see subnational democracy playing out. But this leads, of course, to the question of why is it that criminal governance becomes so violent if it shouldn't be, right? Or if we know of other cases where it hasn't been the case. I think that we have to understand the nature of how of ongoing violence in the Mexican context of turf wars, where territories are being still contested, but that doesn't mean being unable to exert controls, right? If we were thinking about the monopoly, for example, in a context of monopoly of violence, this criminal governance regimes would probably be looking different. But what we're looking here is a deep competition still going on, but that doesn't mean that the possibility of exerting controls is absent. I think that is something that we're very clear on how it is occurring. And I just want to quickly go over a question that Gustavo has touched upon that is very close to how for me this agenda started, understanding what is it that citizens can do in the face of this of violence, and to what extent can they actually make governments accountable. I'm still hopeful that turnover can be can lead to accountability in the longer run, but I think that for that to occur, there are many other steps in the way that need to start to change in terms of the borders and in information, getting a better understanding of violence, that it's so complex that it's hard to attribute responsibility and who's responsible for what. And at the same time, changing incentives, as you were all referring to, and how to change incentives for politicians on precisely on how blame becomes widespread across levels of government, and to the extent that leads to further confusion among voters, then it becomes hard to think of how turnover can eventually lead us to reach that place of further accountability and through elections. That being said, however, I think that there have been spaces, right, for turnover, for information to become more widespread and effectively hold politicians accountable through electoral and non-electoral means. Guillermo?
Okay. So what I would say is thank you again for your very sharp and very generous read of the book. And it really truly means a lot to us because of the quality of the scholarship that you yourselves produce. So thank you for that. What I would say is that one of the takeaway messages that we get from this book and that we would like to share with the audience is that these are very complex problems and you don't have a simple solution. So we often hear Mexico's current president say, we're going to get to the root problem. It's one cause. No, I mean, we have thought about this for a long time alongside with many other people. We've thought about this theoretically. We've thought about the multiple causes, and methodologically the reason why we don't jump straight into the experimental or quasi-experimental analysis to show that electoral politics, changes in electoral politics may cause violence. We do the classic regression analysis partly to recognize that there's many alternative explanations and there's many potential factors driving in economic, social, demographic, playing at the global level, at the national level, at the state level, at the municipal level, at the neighborhood level, all that. And it's a very complex problem. So we're only trying to show one slice, which is the politics. But once you unpack the politics, you hit, as Gustavo was saying, you hit many other dimensions. And let me just get back to a question that, Gustavo, you, with all the frustration that I think we carry as citizens of democracies, and specifically of Mexico's thin illiberal democracy, is that we ask the question, when is it that we will be able to dissociate electoral mechanisms as triggers of violence? When is it that, because if you look over the past 20 years, as electoral democracy becomes more ingrained, competition becomes more intense, as you have more plurality, more diversity, you have more violence. And violence is going just exponential. And every election cycle, every new election cycle, we're going to have next year a massive subnational election cycle along with midterm elections. It's most likely going to be the most violent episode in Mexico's history, not just in terms of mass violence, but also in terms of selective violence. And the more electoral authorities, the more politicians, government authorities ignore this issue, the more we say, well, we're going to play that, you know, we're reforming the judiciary. Y la fiscalía ahora es independiente. It's not. And the more we say, well, the military, these are good guys. Well, go back to the 70s. They have a long history of repression and corruption. The more we postpone security sector reforms, reforming the military, democratizing the military, the more we postpone reforming the multiple police layers, trying to identify who are those. I heard a lot this idea of unifying police forces. saying the bad guys are the municipal ones, let's give the power to the state level police. Well, read this book and you're gonna find that that's not the case. You're really gonna centralize power if you empower the state judicial police. You know, the narcos and all organized criminal groups and the ecosystem of criminal violence is gonna be booming and happy. So let's try to go piece by piece, dissect piece by, there's not one single solution. There's not one administration that will change this. This is a generational or multiple generations of multiple cumulative reforms. But that have to be very clear that this is not a single problem. It's just that you fix the economy. You provide a better, more possibilities for the young. No? If we would only legalize drugs, it's not just a one single solution, because this is very complex. As Sandra was saying, we went from 6 groups to 60 groups to more than 200 groups competing all over the territory, not just for drug trafficking, but for all kinds of illicit activities, extraction of human resources, extraction of natural resources. This has been a major explosion that requires very fine responses and that we think about, you know, we are trapped in a federal system. That's what we often hear. Well, for certain solutions, you need to go outside the box and think about national responses rather than subnational responses. For certain issues, you need to have national responses. And finally, what I would say is that we need to think outside the box, not only in terms of changes in ordinary institutions. Violence and levels of gross human rights violations in Mexico have scaled to such unprecedented, even for Latin American standards, levels of violence, that we need to look into extraordinary mechanisms. And the combinations of extraordinary mechanisms and ordinary changes in ordinary institutions is something we seriously need to explore. This is something that members of civil society and academia have been pushing for, because maybe in 2000, by reforming ordinary institutions, you could have prevented a lot of this violence. Fast forward 20 years, with the levels of atrocities that we have in Mexico, no ordinary institutions, even if they work well right now, would be able to handle this and turn things around for the country. Anyway, thank you, Aníbal, back to you.
Thank you, Guillermo. Guillermo, Sandra, we could really stay, I think, for another hour discussing this book, for sure. Unfortunately, however, we are running out of time. And I know that some people in the audience still have questions, but unfortunately, we have to close the discussion at this point. I want to really thank the 2 fantastic discussants for today. Gustavo and Ana, who did a wonderful job. Like Raul Pacheco Vega, I want to congratulate you, Guillermo and Sandra, for this fantastic book, which is clearly is going to make an impact in the field. And I want to thank, of course, the people at Kellogg who have made this possible. Therese Hanlon, Tim Checkley, Karen Clay, Karen Joseph, who have been in the background making this presentation possible today. And all the members of the audience who join us. For those of you who still have questions and want to talk more about this book, there is going to be another segment of the presentation of the book in Spanish on September 23rd, organized by CIDE, and we really encourage you to also participate in this Spanish presentation. Thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you, Guillermo and Sandra, for this fantastic book, and we look forward to stay in touch.